Hey there, my friend. I see you've settled in. That coffee smells just right, doesn't it? There's something about the steam rising from a mug that opens the heart to a good story. And believe me, the story of Antonia is one that needs a wide-open heart. Before we get into the grit and the tears, I want you to really see where she came from. You can't understand the height of a mountain without looking at the valley it rose from, right? Eldoria wasn't just a city. It was a living, breathing creature. It sat on the edge of the sapphire ocean like a queen guarding her treasures. To the wealthy in the high districts, it was a place of marble and silk, but to Antonia, Eldoria was the smell of drying nets, the taste of salt on the wind, and the sound of the morning call. That chorus of vendors, seagulls, and crashing waves that woke the world every day at dawn. She grew up in Harbor's Edge. Now, don't go picturing a slum. Harbor's Edge was modest, sure, but it was rich in things money can't buy. The houses were small, built close together with weathered wood that had turned a soft, silvery gray from years of sea spray. Every porch had a story. Every window box was bursting with life. This was where Antonia learned what it meant to be part of a community. If a fisherman came home with an empty net, his neighbor shared a portion of their catch. If a roof leaked, 5 men would be up there with hammers before the rain even stopped. Antonia was the heartbeat of her mother's small cottage. Her father had been taken by the sea when she was just a toddler. The ocean gives, but it takes two, leaving her mother, Mama Ife, to raise her alone. Mama Ife was a woman of iron and herbs. She had a garden in the back that was legendary. While other kids were playing tag in the alleys, Antonia was at her mother's hip, learning the language of the earth. "Look at this leaf, Antonia," her mother would say, her voice like smooth river stones. "This is ginger lily. It's for the stomach. And this is lemon balm for the spirit when it gets too heavy. You have to listen to what the plants tell you. They don't lie like people do." Antonia would spend hours in that garden. She grew up with soil under her fingernails and the scent of crushed rosemary in her hair. She wasn't just a girl who helped out. She was a girl who saw the magic in the mundane. She'd watch the way the sun filtered through the palm fronds, turning the dust motes into dancing gold. She'd listen to the rhythm of her mother's mortar and pestle. Asterisk thump, swish, thump asterisk, as she ground peppers and spices for their evening meal. By the time she reached her 20s, Antonia had blossomed into a woman people couldn't help but notice. She wasn't flashy. She didn't have the expensive jewels of the city ladies, but she had a glow. Her eyes were like deep amber pools, reflecting a soul that hadn't been hardened by the world yet. And her laugh, man, that laugh, it was a melody, a bright, bubbling sound that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. Then came the Harvest Festival. In Eldoria, the Harvest Festival was the event of the year. The whole city would gather at the waterfront. Lanterns made of colored paper were strung from the masts of ships, reflecting in the dark water like fallen stars. There was music everywhere. Drums that thrummed in your chest, flutes that teased the air. Antonia was wearing a simple cotton dress, the color of a sunset, that she'd stitched herself. She was dancing with her friends, her curls bouncing, her feet bare on the cool sand. She felt alive, connected to the rhythm of the city she loved. And that's when she saw him. Victor Langston didn't belong in Harbor's Edge. You could tell by the way his clothes fit. Tailored linen, a silk vest, boots that hadn't seen a day of hard labor. He was standing near the edge of the dance floor, a glass of palm wine in his hand, looking like a man who owned the world. But when his eyes landed on Antonia, that confident look faltered. He approached her with a grace that felt like poetry. "You're the rhythm this city needs," he told her, his voice a low, smooth baritone. Antonia, usually so quick with a quip, found herself breathless. "The city has plenty of rhythm, sir. I'm just a girl from the edge." "Then the edge is where the treasure is hidden," Victor replied, flashing a smile that was brighter than the lanterns. The courtship that followed was something out of a dream. Victor was a trader, a man of the world. He brought her things she'd only heard of in stories. Saffron from the northern deserts, silk from across the great sea, chocolate that melted on her tongue like a sweet secret. He would take her for walks along the cliffs, pointing out the grand mansions in the distance. "One day, Antonia," he'd say, his arm draped around her shoulders, "I'll build you a palace up there. You won't have to worry about the price of grain or the salt rotting the wood of your porch. I'll give you the world." Antonia would look at him, her heart swelling. "I don't need the world, Victor. I just need you. I like the salt. I like the grain. It's who I am." But Victor would just kiss her forehead and promise her more. He was a man of ambition, a man who saw life as a ladder to be climbed. At the time, Antonia saw that ambition as strength. She saw his desire to provide as a sign of his deep love. She didn't see the shadows hiding behind his bright eyes, the way he looked at her calloused hands with a tiny flicker of distaste, or the way he seemed to avoid her mother's humble cottage whenever possible. They married a year later. It was a beautiful day, the kind where the sky is so blue it hurts to look at. They stood by the sea, the waves acting as their choir. Mama Ife cried, not because she was sad, but because she saw her daughter flying so far from the nest. Antonia wore a dress she'd spent months embroidering with patterns of waves and herbs, a tribute to her home and her mother. For the first few years, life was a blissful blur. They rented a cottage that was a step up from where she'd grown up, but still within the sound of the ocean. Antonia was happy. She spent her days experimenting in the kitchen, taking the exotic spices Victor brought home and blending them with the local flavors of Eldoria. She made spicy stewed fish with plantains that were so good, the neighbors would find excuses to walk past their window just to catch a whiff. Victor's business was thriving. He was away often, traveling to distant ports, but he always came back with his arms full of gifts and his heart full of stories. He'd tell her about the spice markets of Zale, the silk weavers of the highlands, and the bustling ports where the water was so clear you could see the fish 100 feet down. "You should come with me next time," he'd say, pulling her close in their small bed. "And leave my garden?" she'd tease. "The peppers would miss me too much. I'll buy you 1,000 gardens," he'd whisper against her neck. They talked about children. They talked about names like Malik for a boy or Senna for a girl. Antonia would picture them running through the house, their laughter joining hers. She felt like she was standing on the threshold of a long golden afternoon. She had no idea the sun was about to go down. You see, my friend, that's the thing about happiness. It can make you blind. It can make you forget that the same ocean that brings the trade ships can also bring the storm. Antonia was so wrapped up in her love for Victor, so focused on the life they were building, that she didn't notice the subtle shift in the wind. She didn't notice that Victor's business trips were becoming longer. She didn't notice that he stopped asking about her mother's garden. She didn't notice that the silk scarves he brought her were starting to feel less like gifts and more like apologies. Then the cough started. It was just a small thing at first, a tickle in the back of her throat during a particularly humid evening. She ignored it. She made herself some ginger tea, the way her mother taught her, and went about her day. But the cough didn't go away. It grew deeper, heavier. Soon, a fatigue began to settle over her, a weight that felt like she was walking through chest-high water. "You're just working too hard," Victor told her one morning, looking at her with a concerned frown. "Rest today. I'll have the neighbor's daughter come in to help with the cleaning." But rest didn't help. The fever followed the fatigue. It would come in the night, a silent thief stealing her breath and leaving her drenched in sweat. Her once vibrant skin began to lose its luster. Her amber eyes grew dull. Mama Ife came over every day, her brow furrowed with a worry she tried to hide. She brought every herb in her garden, every root she could find in the woods. "This isn't a normal cold, Antonia," she whispered one night as she wiped her daughter's brow. "This is a fever of the blood. It's deep." Victor was there, too, in the beginning. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, reading her stories from his travels. He looked like the devoted husband the world thought he was. But as the weeks turned into months, and Antonia didn't get better, as she grew thinner and the house grew quieter, the devotion began to fray. I want you to imagine Antonia lying there in that bed, watching the man she loved drift away. It wasn't a sudden departure. It was a slow receding of the tide. He'd spend more time at the office. He'd have to stay late for meetings. He stopped bringing her silk. He stopped talking about the palace on the hill. The silence in the house became deafening. The only sound was Antonia's ragged breathing and the distant roar of the ocean she used to love. She was 26 years old, and she felt like she was 100. Her dreams of children, of a restaurant, of a life filled with laughter, they were all being swallowed by the fever. And that, my friend, is where the shadows began to close in. But don't you worry. This story is just getting started. Take a sip of your coffee. We're about to head into the heart of the storm. Here we go, my friend. Keep that coffee close because the air in this part of the story gets a little chilly. We're moving from the warmth of the sun into the long, cold shadow of betrayal. It's a part of the story that's hard to tell, but you can't appreciate the dawn if you don't understand the depth of the night. The fever didn't just sit on Antonia. It moved into her, taking up residence like an unwelcome tenant who had no intention of leaving. The doctors from the city center, men in stiff collars who smelled of antiseptic and looked at Harbor's Edge with turned-up noses, called it the whispering malaise. They said it came from the humid winds of the southern reaches. They prescribed expensive tinctures in cobalt bottles that did little more than make Antonia's head spin. Mama Ife, however, knew better. She stayed by Antonia's bedside, her hands stained green and brown from the roots she was constantly mashing. "It's a thief, Antonia," she whispered, pressing a cool cloth to her daughter's burning forehead. "It's trying to steal your fire, but we won't let it." But even with Mama Ife's devotion, the fire was dimming. Antonia's world shrunk to the four walls of her bedroom. She grew so thin that her wedding ring, once a perfect fit, began to slide off her finger. She'd look at it, the gold dull in the dim light, and a cold knot of dread would form in her stomach. A knot that had nothing to do with the fever. Because while the illness was physical, the real pain was coming from the man who was supposed to be her anchor. At first, as I told you, Victor was the picture of the concerned husband. But as the months dragged on, the mask began to slip. You see, Victor Langston was a man who loved the idea of Antonia, the vibrant, dancing girl of the Harvest Festival. He didn't know what to do with the pale, shivering woman who needed her soup blown cold and her pillows turned every hour. He was a man built for the heights of life, and he had no stomach for the valleys. The first sign of the shift was the silence. He stopped telling her about his day. He'd come home late, the scent of expensive cigars and imported brandy clinging to his coat, and he'd stand in the doorway of their bedroom, looking at her not with love, but with a kind of clinical pity. "How are you feeling tonight?" he'd ask, his voice flat. "A little better, I think." Antonia would lie, her voice a raspy shadow of its former self. "The ginger tea helped." "Good," he'd say, but he wouldn't come closer. He wouldn't sit on the edge of the bed. He wouldn't take her hand. He'd just turn and go to the spare room, claiming he didn't want to disturb her rest or catch the vapors. Then came the emergency business. "The shipping lanes are in chaos, Antonia," he told her one Tuesday morning. Avoid her gaze as he packed a leather valise. "I have to go to the upper district. I might be gone a week, maybe two. I've left some coins with the neighbor." "A week?" Antonia's heart hammered against her ribs. "But the doctor is coming on Friday, Victor. He said he'd have the new results." "Business doesn't wait for doctors," he snapped, and the sharpness in his voice made her flinch. It was the first time he'd ever used that tone with her. He caught himself, softening his features just enough to pass for kind. "I'm doing this for us, Antonia, to pay for these medicines. You want to get better, don't you?" He left before she could answer, and he stayed gone for 3 weeks. While he was away, the whispers started finding their way into the cottage. Harbor's Edge was a place where news traveled faster than the tide. Neighbors would come by with bowls of broth, their eyes darting around the increasingly dusty house. "Have you heard about the Thorn estate?" One woman, a fishmonger's wife named Marta, asked one afternoon while Mama Aoife was out gathering wood. Antonia, propped up by pillows, shook her head. "No." "Why?" Marta bit her lip, looking conflicted. "Oh, nothing. Just big parties. They say Lavinia Thorne is looking for a new partner for her shipping empire. Someone with local connections and city ambition. People say she's been seen at the Golden Anchor with a man who looks remarkably like your Victor." The name hit Antonia like a physical blow. Lavinia Thorne. Everyone in Eldoria knew the name. The Thornes didn't just own ships. They owned the docks, the warehouses, and probably the very air people breathed in the upper district. Lavinia was a widow in her 30s, a woman described as made of marble and emeralds. She was the pinnacle of the world Victor had always craved. Antonia tried to dismiss it. "Marta is a gossip," she told herself. Victor loves me. He's working. He's building that palace he promised. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and in the fertile soil of her loneliness, it grew like a weed. When Victor finally returned, he was different. He wore a new silk waistcoat, a deep, royal purple, and he carried himself with a swagger that felt aggressive. He didn't bring Antonia silk or cinnamon this time. He brought nothing but excuses. The confrontation happened on a night when the sky was bruising into a deep, stormy violet. Thunder rumbled over the ocean, sounding like heavy furniture being moved across the heavens. Antonia had managed to pull herself out of bed, her legs shaking, her body draped in an oversized shawl. She was sitting in the kitchen, waiting for him. When Victor walked in, he stopped dead. "What are you doing out of bed? You look like a ghost." "A ghost in my own home, Victor?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, fueled by a sudden, cold clarity. "Or just an inconvenience?" Victor sighed, dropping his bag on the table. "I don't have time for this, Antonia. I've had a long journey." Was it long from the upper district? Or just long from the Thorne mansion? The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rain beginning to lash against the windowpane. Victor didn't deny it. He didn't flush with guilt. Instead, he looked at her with a chillingly detached expression. "So you've heard," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, looking at her as if she were a business deal that had gone south. "Let's be honest, Antonia. Look at you. You've been in that bed for nearly a year. The doctors say you might never fully recover. I'm a man of ambition. I have a future. I can't spend the rest of my life tending to a dying flame." "A dying flame?" Antonia whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I am your wife, Victor. We stood by the sea. We made vows. Vows are for people who stay the same," Victor said, and the cruelty in his voice was like a knife. "Life has changed. Lavinia offers me a seat at the table of the elite. She offers me the world I told you I'd build. I can't do that here in this shack with the smell of fish and herbs." He stood up and went to the bedroom. Antonia heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the frantic, rhythmic sound of a man erasing his history. She couldn't move. She felt like her heart had finally stopped beating, and it was the fever of betrayal that had finished the job. He came back out 10 minutes later, his bags packed. He didn't look at the kitchen table. He didn't look at the small herb garden visible through the window. "I've left some money on the sideboard," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "It's enough for a few months. After that, well, your mother knows her way around a garden. You'll manage." "Victor," she called out, her voice cracking. "Is she worth it? Is the silk worth the soul you're leaving behind?" He didn't answer. He stepped out into the rain, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Antonia collapsed, not into a heap of tears, but into a void. The betrayal was so massive, so complete, that her mind couldn't even process the pain yet. She just sat there in the dark, the rain drumming a funeral march on the roof. Mama Ife found her there an hour later. She didn't ask questions. She saw the empty sideboard, the missing coat, the space where Victor's presence used to be. She gathered her daughter into her arms, rocking her back and forth. "He's gone, Mama," Antonia whispered into her mother's shoulder. "He left me for dead." "Then he is the one who is dead, my child," Mama Ife said, her voice fierce. "A man who leaves his heart behind has no life in him. But you are still breathing. And as long as you breathe, the fire is still there. We just have to find the spark." The days that followed were the lowest of the low. The whispering malaise seemed to feast on Antonia's grief. She sank back into the fever, deeper than before. She heard the neighbors talking outside her window, pitying her, wondering how long she had left, whispering about how Victor was already seen at the theater with Lavinia, looking like he'd never spent a day in Harbor's Edge. She lost the house, without Victor's business income, and with the meager coins he'd left quickly vanishing into the pockets of doctors who still offered no cure. The landlord, a man from the city who cared more for gold than for people, came knocking. "I'm sorry, Madam Langston," he said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "But the rent is 3 weeks behind. I have a new tenant ready to move in. A healthy one." Antonia and her mother were forced into a tiny, dilapidated shack on the very edge of the market district, a place where the air was thick with the smell of rotting fruit and the noise of the city never stopped. It was a far cry from the breezy cottage by the sea. Antonia lay on a thin mat on the floor, watching the cockroaches scurry across the ceiling. She felt discarded. She felt like a piece of broken porcelain that had been swept into the corner because it was no longer beautiful or useful. "Why me?" she'd whisper into the dark. "What did I do to deserve this?" There was no answer, only the sound of the city's indifference. But something was happening deep inside her. In the absolute vacuum of her loss, a tiny, hard grain of something was forming. It wasn't hope yet. It was something sharper, something more primal. It was the will to not be a victim. One morning, the fever broke. It didn't fade. It broke like a dam. Antonia woke up drenched in sweat, but for the first time in a year, the weight on her chest was gone. Her lungs felt clear. Her head felt sharp. She sat up, her bones clicking, her muscles screaming in protest. She looked at her mother, who was asleep in the chair, her face etched with exhaustion. "Mama," Antonia whispered. Mama Ife jumped, her eyes wide. "Antonia? Are you back?" Antonia looked at her thin, scarred hands. She looked at the grimy walls of the shack. She thought of Victor in his silk vest, and she thought of the girl who used to dance on the sand. "I'm back, Mama," Antonia said, her voice raspy but steady. "I'm back, and I'm hungry." It was the first meal she'd eaten with gusto in a year, and as she chewed on a piece of dry bread, she made a vow to herself. Victor might have taken her home, her health, and her heart, but he hadn't taken her hands, and he hadn't taken the recipes that lived in her blood. She was going to rise, not for him, not to show him up, but because she was Antonia, and the rhythm of the city was still beating in her chest, even if it was a little bruised. But my friend, the road from a floor mat to the future is a long one, and it was about to get even more complicated. Now grab a refill of that coffee, my friend, because we're moving into the part of the story where the sweat meets the dirt. This is where the theory of resilience becomes the practice of survival. It's one thing to say you're going to rise. It's another thing entirely to do it when your bones still feel like they're made of glass and your pockets are as empty as a dry well. When the fever finally left Antonia, it didn't leave her whole. It left her a stranger to herself. She'd look in the cracked mirror in their new, grimy shack and see a woman she didn't recognize. Skin pulled tight over prominent cheekbones, eyes that looked too large for her face, and hands that shook when she tried to lift a heavy kettle. She was a woman who had been hollowed out, first by illness and then by the man she'd given her soul to. "You need to rest, Antonia," Mama Ife would say, watching her daughter try to pace the small room. "The body is like a field. You can't plant the next crop until the soil has recovered. The soil is fine, Mama, Antonia would reply, though she had to sit down immediately after speaking. But the field is being taxed. We have no money. The landlord for this hole expects his coins on Monday. I won't be a beggar. Not in the city where I used to dance. But the reality was stark. They had nothing. Victor had been thorough in his departure. He'd taken the pride, the comfort, and the security. All Antonia had left were her memories and a small trunk of clothes from her better days. That Friday, Antonia did something that felt like cutting off a limb. She opened that trunk. She pulled out the silk scarves Victor had brought from Zale. The emerald green one that matched the ocean, the golden one that caught the sun. She pulled out a locket that held a lock of her father's hair. And finally, at the very bottom, wrapped in a clean but yellowed sheet, she pulled out her wedding dress. She ran her fingers over the embroidery. The waves she'd stitched with such hope, the tiny herbs she'd added for luck. She remembered the salt air on her skin as she stood by the water, the way Victor's hand felt steady in hers. It wasn't just a dress. It was a map of a future that no longer existed. Antonia, no, Mama Ife whispered from the doorway. Not the dress. It's just cloth, Mama, Antonia said, her voice brittle. Clothes don't feed us. Clothes don't buy a cart. I'm trading a ghost for a life. She walked to the upper district, a long, agonizing trek for her weakened body. She felt the eyes of the city on her. She was a woman of Harbor's Edge, dusty and thin, walking into the world of marble. She found a high-end merchant who dealt in pre-loved finery for the aspiring middle class. The merchant, a man with spectacles perched on a bulbous nose, looked at the dress with a practiced, cynical eye. He felt the silk, inspected the stitching. Fine work, he muttered, but the style is a bit local. I can give you 10 silver pieces for the lot. 10 silver pieces. It was an insult. The embroidery alone had taken 3 months of her life. But Antonia looked him in the eye, her amber gaze hard as flint. 15. And I keep the locket. They settled on 12. Antonia walked out of that shop with 12 pieces of silver pressed into her palm. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford the moisture. She went straight to the market and bought a second-hand wooden cart, 2 large iron pots, a bag of coal, and enough rice, peppers, and oil to last a week. Hope's hearth, she told her mother that evening as they scrubbed the wooden cart in the alleyway. That's a big name for a roadside buka, Antonia, Mama Ife said, a small, proud smile tugging at her lips. It's not just a buka, Antonia said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. It's a statement. Everyone in this city is hungry for something, Mama, not just food. They're hungry for a reason to keep going. I'll give them both. The first few weeks were a descent into a special kind of hell. Antonia's routine was brutal. She rose at 4 in the morning, her body screaming for more sleep. She'd start the coals, the smoke stinging her eyes in the damp morning air. She'd chop onions until her fingers were numb, the scent of ginger and garlic filling the tiny shack. By 6, she'd be pushing that heavy cart toward the market district. Every cobblestone was an enemy. Every hill was a mountain. She'd arrive at her spot, a dusty corner near the main gates where the laborers and fishermen passed by, and she'd start to cook. The first day, she sold 3 bowls of rice. The second, 5. The third, a group of dockworkers followed the scent of her spicy stewed fish and cleaned her out by noon. Hey, madam, one of them shouted, wiping red oil from his beard. This tastes like my grandmother's kitchen back in the islands. Where'd you learn to season like this? Antonia wiped the sweat from her brow, a genuine smile breaking through her fatigue. I learned from the earth and I learned from the sea. Come back tomorrow. I'm making peanut stew. As the weeks turned into months, Antonia became a fixture. People started calling her Madame Antonia. They didn't know about the illness or the betrayal. They only knew the woman who served warmth in a bowl. But the work took its toll. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and scarred from the hot oil. Her face grew weathered by the sun. And the hurt from Victor, that didn't go away. It just changed shape. It became the fuel that kept her moving. Every time she felt like she couldn't push the cart another inch, she'd think of Victor's face as he walked out the door. She'd think of Lavinia Thorne's emeralds. And she'd push. But then came the rain. In Eldoria, when the rainy season hits, it doesn't just drizzle. The sky opens up like a wound. One afternoon, a sudden, violent storm swept in off the bay. The market vendors scrambled to cover their wares. Antonia struggled to pull her colorful umbrella over the cart, the wind whipping her apron around her legs. Across the street, huddled under a leaking awning of a closed textile shop, she saw them. They looked like a single, shivering mass at first. 3 small figures, their skin gray with cold, their clothes nothing more than rags held together by grime. They were the kind of children Eldoria tried to pretend didn't exist. The invisibles who lived in the crawl spaces and fed on the scraps the dogs wouldn't touch. Antonia watched them. 2 girls and a boy. They were triplets, clearly same structure of the face, same wild, matted curls. The boy, who looked like the eldest by a few minutes, was standing in front of the girls. His small chest puffed out as if he could shield them from the torrential downpour. They were staring at her cart, not with the eyes of children looking for a treat, but with the hollow, desperate gaze of the truly starving. Antonia looked at her last pot of egusi soup. She'd been hoping to sell it to the evening crowd to buy coal for the morning. If she gave it away, she'd be working for free that day. She'd be hungry herself. She thought of her own abandonment. She thought of how it felt to be left for dead on a bed of fever. "Hey!" she yelled over the roar of the rain. "You 3, come over here." The children didn't move. They looked at each other, suspicion etched into their young faces. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I said come here." Antonia beckoned them fiercely. "I'm not going to bite. And the soup is getting cold." Hunger finally overruled fear. They shuffled across the muddy road, their bare feet splashing in the puddles. Up close, they were in even worse shape than she'd realized. The boy had a jagged scar across his cheek that looked like it had been made by a broken bottle. One of the girls had a nasty bruise on her arm. Antonia didn't ask questions. She didn't lecture them about being on the streets. She simply ladled the thick, yellow soup into 3 wooden bowls, piling them high with pounded yam. "Eat," she commanded. They fell on the food like animals. There were no manners, only the sound of frantic swallowing and the clatter of spoons against wood. Antonia watched them, a lump forming in her throat that had nothing to do with her own hunger. "What are your names?" she asked softly as they reached the bottom of their bowls. The boy looked up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes were sharp, older than his years. "I'm Kai," he said. "This is Zara. And the little one is Lena. Where is your mother, Kai?" The boy's expression didn't change, but his grip on the bowl tightened. "Gone. The fever took her last year. Our uncle, he didn't want 3 more mouths. He threw us out in the great frost." Antonia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The fever. It had taken their mother's life, and it had taken Antonia's world. They were bound by the same ghost. "And where do you sleep?" "Wherever the watchmen don't look," Zara whispered. She was the one with the bold eyes, despite her shaking limbs. Sometimes the docks, sometimes the alleys. Antonia looked at her cart, her hope's hearth. She realized that hope wasn't something you could just serve in a bowl and walk away from. Hope was a commitment. "Listen to me," Antonia said, leaning down so she was at eye level with them. "I'm here every day, from dawn until the sun touches the sea. If you're hungry, you come to this cart. You don't beg, you don't steal from the other vendors. You come here. Do you understand?" The triplets looked at her as if she were a vision from a dream. "Why?" Kai asked, his voice defensive. "What do you want from us?" Antonia reached out and tucked a matted curl behind Zara's ear. Her hand was rough and scarred, but her touch was as light as a feather. Because someone once left me for dead too, she said. And I decided that as long as I'm standing, no one else goes out like that. Not on my watch. The rain began to let up, the sun peeking through the clouds like a shy child. The triplets stayed for a while, helping her pack up the cart. An act of gratitude they didn't have words for. As she pushed the cart back toward her shack that evening, her legs felt lighter. Her pockets were empty of coins, but her heart felt like it had finally found a rhythm that didn't involve Victor Langston. She had 3 storm birds now, and she had a feeling that the real test of her strength was only just beginning. The coffee in your mug might be getting a little cold, my friend, so let's warm things up with the fire of a woman's spirit. We've reached the part of the story where the routine of survival turns into the ritual of family. You see, Antonia didn't just start a business. She accidentally started a revolution of the heart in a city that had forgotten how to care. The days following that rainy afternoon didn't just blur. They marched. Antonia found herself caught in a new, demanding rhythm. It wasn't just about the pots and the coals anymore. It was about the 3 sets of eyes that would appear at the corner of the market gate every single morning at 7 o'clock sharp. They were like clockwork. Kai, Zara, and Lena. They didn't come to the cart with their hands out like beggars. They came with their sleeves rolled up, or what was left of their sleeves. Kai, the oldest and the one with the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders, took it upon himself to be the water bearer. Before Antonia could even ask, he'd have the heavy plastic jugs filled from the public tap 3 blocks away. His face set in a grim mask of determination as he lugged them back. "You don't have to do that, Kai," Antonia told him one morning, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. "I can pay the water boys a copper to bring it." "They're slow," Kai grunted, setting the jugs down with a thud. "And they spill half of it." "I don't spill." Zara, the bold one, became Antonia's fry cook in training. She had a natural flair for the heat. She'd stand on an upturned crate so she could reach the big iron skillet, her eyes wide as she watched Antonia flip the akara, the golden bean fritters, with a practiced flick of the wrist. Zara loved the sizzle. She loved the way the batter turned from a pale mash into a crisp, savory jewel. And then there was Lena, little Lena the dreamer. She was too small for the heavy lifting and too timid for the fire. Instead, she became the guardian of the atmosphere. She'd find discarded bottle caps, bits of colorful ribbon from the textile district, or smooth sea stones, and she'd arrange them on the edge of Antonia's cart. She'd take a stick and draw intricate patterns in the dust around the plastic chairs, turning the dirt into a tapestry. "It makes the food taste better if the place looks pretty," Lena whispered when Antonia asked what she was doing. Antonia felt a strange, terrifying warmth spreading through her chest. It was the kind of warmth she'd sworn off the night Victor walked out. She tried to tell herself it was just professional, that she was just employing them in exchange for meals. But you can't lie to your own heart for long, especially when you're sewing patches onto a boy's only shirt by the light of a flickering tallow candle. "Why are you doing this, Antonia?" Mama Ife asked one night. They were back in their shack, and Antonia was meticulously repairing a tear in Zara's ragged dress. "You can barely afford the coal as it is. Now you're feeding 3 more, and buying them thread and soap." Antonia didn't look up from her needle. "They're storm birds, Mama. If I don't help them fly, they'll drown in the mud. And besides, the cart is doing better. People like seeing them there. They say the kind madam has the best helpers in Eldoria." Mama Ife sat down, her old bones creaking. "It's a dangerous thing, loving something that isn't yours, especially when the world is as cruel as it is." "I know," Antonia said, the needle pausing for a second. "But I've already lost everything once. What's left to fear?" But the world, as Mama Ife warned, was watching. And Eldoria's market wasn't just a place of commerce. It was a nest of vipers. There were other vendors, people who had been there for years who didn't like the attention Antonia was getting. They didn't like that her buka, Hope's Hearth, was becoming a destination. Mrs. Gable, a woman who sold sour porridge 3 stalls down, was the worst of them. She had a face like a dried plum and a heart to match. She'd watch Antonia and the triplets with a narrowed, suspicious gaze. "You're asking for trouble, Madame Antonia?" Mrs. Gable hissed one afternoon, her voice like sandpaper. "Taking in street rats. They'll rob you blind the second your back is turned. Or worse, they'll bring the city watch down on all of us. We don't want those invisibles drawing attention to our licenses." Antonia didn't blink. She continued stirring her pot of jollof rice, the steam carrying the scent of thyme and Scotch bonnet peppers. "They aren't rats, Mrs. Gable. They're children. And as for my back, it's been turned to the wind for a long time. I think I can handle a little dust." But the comments stung. They reminded Antonia of the whispers she'd heard when she was sick, the way the neighborhood had pitied her, then discarded her. She began to feel a fierce, protective wall rising around the triplets. She started teaching them more than just cooking. She taught them how to count the coins, how to spot counterfeit copper, and how to speak to the customers with a dignity that demanded respect. "You walk tall," she told Kai one evening as they packed up. "You look them in the eye. You aren't taking a handout, you're providing a service. You're part of Hope's hearth." Kai looked at her, his sharp eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "Thank you, Auntie." That was the first time they called her Auntie. Not Madam, not teacher, but Auntie. It was a bridge crossed, a bond sealed in the steam of the buka. For 2 years, this was their world. The seasons shifted, the dust of the dry season giving way to the mud of the rains, and back again. Antonia's business grew, but she never moved to a fancy shop. She kept the cart, but she added a tin roof and a few more chairs. She bought the children's shoes, real leather ones that didn't pinch. She bought Zara a sketchbook and Lena a set of colored pencils. She watched them grow. Kai's voice began to crack and deepen. Zara's height started to catch up to Antonia's shoulder. Lena's drawings became more complex, moving from the dust to the pages of her book. Antonia was happy. It was a quiet, hard-earned happiness. She had forgiven the world for Victor, mostly because she was too busy to think about him. The betrayal was a scar, yes, but it was a scar that had thickened her skin. Then, the morning came that changed everything. Started like any other Tuesday. The mist was clinging to the cobblestones, and the smell of the ocean was heavy and salt-sweet. Antonia arrived at the gate at 7. She set up the coals. She waited. 7:15. No Kai. 7:30. No Zara or Lena. By 8 o'clock, the market was in full swing, but the corner of Hope's hearth felt cold. Antonia's heart began to do a slow, sickening roll in her chest. They were never late. If one was sick, the other two would come to get herbs from Mama Ife. Maybe they found a better gig, Mrs. Gable cackled from her stall. Or maybe they finally made off with that locket you're always wearing. Antonia ignored her, but the panic was a physical weight now. She left her pots under the care of a trusted neighbor and went into the alleys. She went to the crawl spaces where she knew they huddled. She went to the docks, calling their names until her voice was hoarse. Kai, Zara, Lena, nothing. Only the sound of the gulls and the indifferent roar of the city. She spent 3 days searching. She didn't open the buka. She didn't sleep. She went to the city watch, but they just laughed at her. 3 street kids missing? Madam, that's not a crime. That's a Tuesday. They probably hopped a grain ship to the Southern Isles. On the 4th day, a small boy, one of the other invisibles, who sometimes ran errands for the fishmongers, approached her. He looked terrified. Madam Antonia? He whispered, tugging at her apron. Yes? Have you seen them? Kai and the girls. They're gone, madam. A big carriage came. Black wood with silver wheels. Men in uniforms. They took them from the old warehouse near the north gate. Kai fought them, but they were too strong. I heard one of the men say something about a relative and a diamond trade. They said they were taking them across the sea. Antonia felt the world tilt. A relative? They don't have any relatives who care. The man had papers, the boy said, shrugging. Official-looking ones. They didn't look like they were hurting him, madam. Just taking him. Antonia fell back against her cart. Across the sea. The diamond trade. It sounded like a fairy tale, but in Eldoria, fairy tales were often just another word for a different kind of disappearance. She went to the north gate. She asked the guards, but the trail was cold. A private carriage, a private ship. They were gone. The silence that followed was worse than the fever. Hope's hearth stayed open, because Antonia didn't know how to do anything else, but the light had gone out of it. She went back to being the kind madam, but the auntie part of her felt like it had been surgically removed. She kept 3 wooden bowls under the counter. Every day, for a year, she filled them with the best of the day's cooking. And every evening, when the sun touched the sea and the triplets hadn't appeared, she'd give the food to other hungry children. "Why do you keep the bowls, Antonia?" Mama Ife asked one evening. She was getting older now, her eyes cloudy with cataracts. "Because I told them," Antonia said, her voice a low, fierce hum. "I told them that as long as I'm standing, there's a bowl here for them. A promise doesn't have an expiration date, Mama." 5 years passed, then 10. The cart became a permanent stall. Antonia grew gray at the temples. The pain of Victor Langston faded into a dull, distant ache, replaced by the sharper, more constant ache of the 3 empty chairs. She heard rumors of Victor, that he had married Lavinia, that he was the head of the Langston-Thorne shipping line, that he was the wealthiest man in the upper district. She didn't care. His wealth was paper. Hers had been flesh and blood, and it was gone. She became a pillar of the market. She was the one people came to for advice, for a loan of a few coppers, or for a bowl of soup when the world was too heavy. She was the kind madam, the woman who had survived everything and kept her heart open anyway, but she was lonely. Mama Ife passed away quietly in her sleep during a particularly peaceful spring, leaving Antonia truly alone in their small house by the bay, a house Antonia had finally been able to afford from years of saving every penny. She sat on her porch every night, looking at the stars, wondering if Kai, Zara, and Lena were looking at the same ones. Were they alive? Were they happy? Did they remember the smell of her ginger tea? She had no way of knowing that halfway across the world, 3 young people were rising like phoenixes, fueled by the memory of a woman who had fed them when they were nothing. She had no way of knowing that the seeds of compassion she'd planted in the mud of Eldoria were about to bloom into a forest. But that, my friend, is the story for the next cup of coffee. Let's keep that fire going, my friend. You're still with me, right? Good. Because we've reached the part of the story that most people skip, the long, quiet middle. It's the time between the tragedy and the triumph. People love the before and the after, but the during is where a person's soul is truly tempered. Antonia didn't just survive those 15 years. She became a part of the city's bedrock. If you asked anyone in the market district where to find the heart of Eldoria, they wouldn't point you toward the marble government buildings or the fancy boutiques of the upper district. They'd point you toward the blue-awning stall where the air smelled of Scotch bonnets and ancient wisdom. Time in Eldoria has a way of moving like the tide, slow and relentless, reshaping everything it touches. Over 15 years, the city transformed. The cobblestones were paved over with smooth asphalt. The horse-drawn carriages were replaced by the growling engines of motorbikes and the sleek, humming cars of the wealthy. Skyscrapers began to rise in the distance, their glass faces reflecting the sun like giant mirrors, casting long shadows over the humble streets of Harbor's Edge. But Antonia's corner remained a sanctuary of the old world. Hope's hearth was no longer just a wooden cart. It had grown into a sturdy roadside pavilion. The wooden poles were replaced by iron ones, and the colorful umbrella had been traded for a bright blue tin roof that sang a beautiful song whenever the rain hit it. There were plastic tables now, mismatched and scarred by years of use, and a chalkboard where Antonia would write the daily special in her neat, looping script. Antonia herself had aged into a grace that was striking. The silver in her hair had spread, forming a regal crown that she wore in thick, braided coils. Her face was a map of her journey, deep lines around her mouth from the thousands of smiles she'd given to strangers, and fine crinkles around her eyes from squinting against the steam of her pots. Her hands were thick and calloused, the knuckles a bit swollen with the onset of arthritis, but they never lost their precision. She could still debone a fish in seconds or measure out a handful of spices with the accuracy of a scale. She was no longer just Antonia. She was Madame Antonia. Every morning at 4, she still rose. The shack she'd shared with her mother had been replaced by a small, clean cottage overlooking the bay. She'd stand on her porch for a few minutes before starting her day, watching the lanterns of the fishing boats bobbing on the water. It was her time of prayer, a quiet communion with the ghosts of her past. She'd think of Mama Ife, of the triplets, and yes, even of Victor. The anger for Victor had long since evaporated, leaving behind a dry, dusty residue of indifference. She'd see his name in the papers occasionally, * Langston Thorne Shipping Sets New Record *, or Victor Langston hosts annual gala for the elite. He was a titan of the city, a man of power. Sometimes, she'd see his car, a long, black limousine, gliding through the market district on its way to the docks. He never looked out the window. He never saw the woman who had once been his anchor, serving stew to the men who worked for him. And that was fine with Antonia. She had realized that Victor hadn't just left her. He had escaped a version of himself he was too weak to carry. He lived in a world of surfaces while she lived in the deep. One morning, a young boy named Gilo, a spindly 10-year-old with eyes too big for his face, stumbled into her stall. He was shivering, his clothes damp with the morning mist. He reminded her so much of Kai that for a split second, her heart stopped. "Auntie?" he whispered, looking at the steaming pots with a desperate hunger. I don't have coins, but I can sweep. I can fetch the water." Antonia didn't even look at the floor. She grabbed a wooden bowl, one of the 3 special bowls she kept under the counter, and filled it with a rich golden groundnut stew and a mound of rice. "Sit," she said, her voice like a warm blanket. "The sweeping can wait. A hungry stomach has no ears for work." This was her life now. She had become the unofficial mother of the invisibles. She didn't just feed them. She looked out for them. She'd keep an extra stash of herbal ointments Mama Ife had taught her to make, treating their scraped knees and infected cuts. She'd settle disputes between vendors and keep the local bullies away from the smaller kids. "Why do you do it, madam?" A regular customer, a merchant named Ben, asked her one afternoon. Most people would have retired or moved to a quieter street by now. "You've got enough saved to live easy." Antonia wiped down a table, her movements methodical. "A river that stops flowing becomes a swamp. Ben, I stay here because this is where life is. And besides, I'm waiting for someone." Ben chuckled. "Still waiting for those 3? Madam, it's been 15 years. They're probably halfway across the world, living like kings or... Well, you know how it is on the streets." "I know how it is," Antonia said, her amber eyes turning toward the distant horizon where the ships disappeared. "But I know their hearts. They didn't leave because they wanted to. They were taken. And a heart that is taken always wants to find its way back home." It was a beautiful sentiment, but some nights, when the market was dark and the only sound was the rustle of the wind through the palm trees, Antonia felt the weight of those 15 years. She'd look at the 3 bowls sitting empty on the shelf and feel a pang of doubt. Had they forgotten her? Had the diamond trade or the relative or the sheer distance of time washed away the memory of the woman at the cart? She'd pull out the sketchbook Lena had left behind. A small, tattered book filled with drawings of shells and people and the patterns of the dust. She'd run her fingers over the lines, feeling the ghost of the little girl's hand. "I am still here," she'd whisper to the empty room. "I am still standing." Little did she know, the world was already vibrating with the change she'd been praying for. In the upper district, the talk of the town was the arrival of a new investment group, the ZLK Syndicate. No one knew who they were or where they came from, only that they had more capital than the Thorne Empire and a reputation for ethical redevelopment. They had bought up half the abandoned warehouses near the docks and were planning a massive project to build schools and community centers. Antonia heard the rumors, of course. The market was a beehive of gossip. They say the head of the syndicate is a man who can see through walls, one vendor whispered. I heard it's 3 siblings, another added. Young, brilliant, and richer than the stars. Antonia just smiled and kept stirring. To her, the rich were just people with bigger problems and more expensive shoes. She didn't care about syndicates. She cared about the quality of the peppers and the price of the fish. But then, the atmosphere in the market began to shift. Men in suits. Not the stiff, arrogant suits of the city watch, but sleek, modern suits, began walking the streets of Harbor's Edge. They weren't looking for bribes. They were taking notes. They were measuring the distance from the stalls to the water. They were talking to the fishermen. One of them stopped at Hope's hearth. He was a young man, professional and polite. He ordered a bowl of the spicy stewed fish. Antonia served him, watching as he took the first bite. His eyes widened, a look of pure, unadulterated nostalgia crossing his face. Is something wrong? Antonia asked. The man shook his head, looking at the bowl as if it were a holy relic. No, it's exactly as I remember. You've been here before? Antonia asked, her brow furrowing. Not here, the man said carefully, but a place like it. A long time ago. He finished his meal in silence, left a tip that was far too generous, and walked away. Antonia watched him go, a strange, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. That night, the dream came back. She dreamt of the rain, the torrential, healing rain of Eldoria. She dreamt of 3 small figures huddled under an awning, their eyes bright and hungry. But in the dream, they weren't ragged. They were shining. They were wearing robes of silk and crowns of coral. They were walking toward her, and as they reached her, the rain turned into gold. She woke up with the scent of ginger and sea salt in her nostrils. The next morning was the one I told you about. The morning when the air felt different. It was a bright, crisp Tuesday. The sun was rising like a golden coin, and the market was buzzing with a peculiar energy. People were pointing toward the main entrance, their voices hushed. Look at that, Ben whispered, leaning over the counter of Antonia's stall. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. Antonia didn't look up at first. She was busy ladling soup into a bowl for little Gilo. It's just a car, Ben. The city is full of them. Not these cars, madam. Look. Antonia wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. She shielded her eyes against the glare of the morning sun. 3 cars were gliding down the narrow market street. These weren't the noisy, growling cars of the local merchants. They were silent, majestic beasts of chrome and glass. 3 Rolls-Royce Phantoms, 1 black, 1 silver, 1 pearl white. They moved with a predatory grace, the crowds parting before them like the Red Sea. They stopped right in front of the blue awning of Hope's hearth. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the seagulls seemed to stop their squawking. The city held its breath. Antonia felt a sudden, sharp coldness in her chest, followed by a heat so intense she thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of a plastic table to steady herself. Her heart was no longer beating. It was thundering, a wild, rhythmic drum in her ears. The doors of the cars opened simultaneously. Out of the black car stepped a man. He was tall, with shoulders like an ox and a face that was both handsome and formidable. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Antonia's house, but it was the scar on his cheek, a jagged, fading line that made her breath catch. Out of the silver car stepped a woman. She was a vision of elegance, her hair styled in a sophisticated bob, her green dress shimmering like the surface of the bay. She moved with a confidence that commanded the air around her. Out of the pearl white car stepped another woman. She was smaller, with a face that was soft and thoughtful. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm, and her eyes, sharp and observant, were already scanning the stall. They stood there for a long moment, three figures of unimaginable wealth and power, looking at the graying woman in the faded apron. The man stepped forward. His boots clicked on the asphalt, a sound that echoed in the silence. He stopped just a few feet from Antonia. His eyes, once the hollow eyes of a starving child, were now full of a deep, overflowing light. "Auntie," he said. The word was a whisper, but it shattered the silence. Antonia's hand flew to her mouth. The world seemed to dissolve into a blur of color and sound. "Kai?" she whispered. Is it really my Kai? And that, my friend, is where the during ends and the after begins. But the after isn't just about the reunion. It's about justice. It's about the restoration of everything that was stolen. The air in the market didn't just feel still, my friend. It felt like it had been vacuum sealed. You could have heard a needle drop on a silk cushion. There stood Madame Antonia, a woman who had built her life out of the rubble of betrayal and the steam of a soup pot, facing three ghosts who had returned as kings and queens. I want you to really picture this moment. Don't just watch it like a movie. Feel it. Feel the heat of the Eldorian sun on your neck, the smell of the charcoal fire still smoldering in Antonia's stall, and that bizarre, electric tension that comes when the impossible suddenly becomes real. Antonia's legs felt like they were made of water. She reached out, her calloused, spice-stained fingers trembling as they hovered near Kai's face. She didn't want to touch him yet, terrified that her hand would pass right through him like a mist. "Kai," she whispered again, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "My little water-bearer?" Kai didn't wait. He stepped across the threshold of the humble stall, ignoring the dust that clung to his charcoal-gray trousers, and pulled her into an embrace that was 15 years in the making. He was so much taller now, his shoulders broad and solid, a man who had clearly carried heavy burdens and come out stronger. He smelled of expensive cedarwood and the salt of the sea, a scent so far removed from the muddy, shivering boy he'd been. "I told you I'd come back, Auntie," he murmured into her hair, his voice a deep, resonant vibration that she felt in her very bones. "I told you we'd find our way home." Then came Zara and Lena. They didn't care about their silk dresses or the cameras that were beginning to flash in the crowd. They surged forward, a whirlwind of emerald and crimson, enveloping Antonia in a sea of perfume and tears. "Mama," Lena sobbed. The word she had never dared say out loud as a child, but had whispered every night in her dreams. "Oh, Mama Antonia." The crowd in the market finally found its voice. It wasn't a cheer yet. It was a low, rising roar of disbelief. People were climbing onto crates to see. Market women who had known Antonia for decades were weeping openly, wiping their eyes with their aprons. Even the stray dogs seemed to sense the gravity of it, sitting back on their haunches and watching the spectacle. And there, standing by her stall of sour porridge, was Mrs. Gable. Her jaw hadn't just dropped. It looked like it had been unhinged. She stared at the 3 Royces, then at the impeccably dressed street rats she had spent years mocking, and then back at Antonia. For the first time in her bitter life, Mrs. Gable had nothing to say. The silence of her defeat was louder than any shout. Antonia finally pulled back, her hands cupping Zara's face, then Lena's. She was looking for the girls she knew. Underneath the designer makeup and the sophisticated air, she found them. She saw Zara's defiant spark in the way she held her head, and Lena's gentle soul in the depth of her wet eyes. "You're alive?" Antonia breathed, tears carving tracks through the flour and soot on her cheeks. "You're whole. My babies are whole." "We're more than whole, Auntie," Zara said, her voice ringing with a new, sharp authority. She gestured toward the line of cars and the small army of assistants in crisp uniforms who were now stepping out to manage the crowd. "We're everything you told us we could be. Do you remember what you said? Asterisk, a full belly makes the world less scary. Asterisk, you gave us that, and we used it to build an empire." Kai stepped back, his protective gaze never leaving Antonia, but he signaled to one of his associates. A man stepped forward carrying a silver tray. On it sat a single, beautifully wrapped box of deep velvet. "The market isn't the place for this," Kai said softly. "But we couldn't wait another hour. We've spent years planning this day. Every diamond we traded, every building Lena designed, every collection Zara sold. It was all leading back to this spot." The market went quiet again as Antonia took the box. Her fingers, which had scrubbed a million pots, felt clumsy against the velvet. She opened it, expecting jewelry, perhaps a locket to replace the one she'd sold. Instead, she saw a stack of legal documents and a heavy, ornate key. "What is this?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "That," Lena said, wiping a tear from her cheek, "is the deed to the Langston-Thorne estate on the North Cliff." The crowd gasped. The Langston-Thorne estate was the crown jewel of Eldoria. A sprawling mansion with white pillars and gardens that looked like they belonged in a dream. It was the house Victor had promised her. It was the house he had eventually shared with Lavinia. "How?" Antonia whispered. "We bought it," Kai said, and there was a cold, hard satisfaction in his eyes. "We bought it out from under the Langston-Thorne shipping line when their stocks dipped last year. We didn't just buy a house, Auntie. We bought the ground he walked on. It's yours now. All of it. The gardens, the rooms, the view of the sea." Antonia looked at the key, then at the three of them. "But I'm just a woman with a cart. What would I do with a palace?" "You'll live in it," Zara said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "And you'll run the foundation from it. But we'll get to that later. For now, there's one more thing." Kai stepped toward the microphone that his team had set up, not for a speech to the city, but for a declaration to the neighborhood. "People of Harbor's Edge." Kai's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers, reaching every corner of the market. "For 15 years you have watched this woman. You have eaten her food, you have taken her kindness, and some of you have looked down on her." He glanced briefly, sharply, toward Mrs. Gable, who looked like she wanted to melt into the pavement. "Today, Hope's Hearth is no longer just a stall," Kai continued. "Effective immediately, the ZLK Syndicate is providing a grant to every vendor on this block who has stood by Madame Antonia. We are renovating the market. We are bringing in clean water, new roofing, and fair trade agreements. But most importantly," he turned back to Antonia, "we are building the Antonia Culinary Institute right across the street. A place where the children of the Invisibles can learn to cook, to serve, and to lead. You won't be stirring the pots alone anymore, Auntie. You'll be the dean." Antonia sank onto her stool, the same plastic stool that had been her throne for years. The sheer scale of it was too much to process. The betrayal of Victor, the years of hunger, the silence of the triplets' absence. All of it seemed to be being rewritten in real time. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "You owe me nothing. A few bowls of rice. It wasn't worth all this." Zara knelt in the dust at Antonia's feet, taking her rough hands in her soft, manicured ones. "It wasn't just rice, Mama. It was the way you looked at us when no one else would even see us. You gave us a name. You gave us a reason to survive. In the diamond mines, when the work was hard and the air was thin, Kai would whisper your recipes to us. We'd imagine the smell of your ginger tea, and it would keep us going for another day. You didn't just feed our stomachs, you fed our souls. You can't put a price on that." The assistants began to move then, opening the trunks of the other cars. They weren't just here for show. They began handing out packages of high-quality grain, oil, and fresh fruit to the people in the crowd. It was a feast in the middle of the street. The 3 Rolls-Royces sat like guardians, their chrome gleaming in the midday sun. Antonia looked at them, then at her old pots, then at the 3 extraordinary humans she had helped forge. "I need to close the stall," she said suddenly, a bit of her old pragmatism returning. "I have a goosey soup that will go sour if I don't give it out." The triplets laughed, a bright, harmonious sound that blended perfectly with the bustle of the market. "Don't worry about the soup, Auntie," Kai said, offering his arm to her. "We've hired a crew to take care of everything here. Your shift ended 15 years ago. It's time to go home." Antonia stood, dusting off her apron one last time. She didn't take it off. She wanted to remember the feel of it. She took Kai's arm, and with Zara and Lena flanking her, she walked toward the pearl-white Rolls-Royce. As she passed Mrs. Gable's stall, Antonia stopped. The older woman looked terrified, expecting a gloat, a sharp word, or a final dismissal. Antonia just reached into her pocket, pulled out a small sachet of the high-quality saffron Victor had once given her. A sachet she'd kept as a reminder of what real quality looked like. She placed it on Mrs. Gable's counter. "Use this for the porridge, Martha," Antonia said softly. "It needs a bit of color. Life is too short for gray food." And with that, Madame Antonia stepped into the car. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, shutting out the noise of the market and replacing it with the cool, quiet hum of luxury. As the cars began to move, winding their way out of the narrow streets and toward the cliffs of the North District, Antonia looked out the window. She saw the market she had loved, the people she had fed, and the city that had tried to break her. She wasn't looking back with regret. She was looking forward. "My friend, you can only imagine the conversation in that car. But don't worry, I was there for the telling of it. We're going to talk about that first night in the mansion, the confrontation that was brewing with the ghost of Victor, and how a woman who spent her life over a fire learned to live in a house made of marble. Grab one more cup. The story's heart is finally beating at full speed. This is where the story gets really interesting, my friend. You see, most people think that getting the mansion and the money is the happily ever after. But for a woman like Antonia, who had spent 15 years with her feet in the dust and her hands in the fire, luxury wasn't a comfort. It was a foreign country. As the Rolls-Royce climbed the winding roads of the North Cliff, leaving the salty, humid air of the market behind for the crisp, pine-scented breeze of the heights, Antonia felt a strange sense of vertigo. She watched the city of Eldoria shrink below her, the bustling harbor looking like a child's toy set. For the first time in her life, she was looking down on the world, and it terrified her. The gates of the Langston Thorne estate swung open silently, moved by invisible motors. The driveway was a long ribbon of crushed white quartz that crunched musically under the expensive tires. And then there it was, the mansion. It was a neoclassical masterpiece of white stone and soaring pillars, draped in flowering bougainvillea that looked like spilled wine against the walls. It was the house Victor had described to her during those late-night walks on the beach a lifetime ago. Back then, it was a dream used to lure her into a marriage that would eventually break her. Now it was a reality, paid for by the 3 children she had saved from the gutter. "We're here, Mama," Lena whispered, sensing the tension in Antonia's shoulders. The car stopped. A footman, an actual man in a uniform, stepped forward to open the door. Antonia hesitated. She looked at her hands, still smelling faintly of onions and charcoal, and then at the pristine white marble of the entryway. She felt like an intruder in her own life. "I don't belong here, Kai," she said, her voice small in the vast quiet of the estate. "I'm a woman of the edge. This house, it's for people who drink tea out of bone china and never have dirt under their fingernails." Kai took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "This house was built on the backs of people like us, Auntie. But for the first time, it's going to be inhabited by someone with a soul. You aren't an intruder. You're the owner." Walking through those front doors was like walking into a memory. The foyer was vast, with a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of diamonds hanging from a domed ceiling. But as Antonia walked across the polished floors, she didn't see the luxury. She saw the ghosts. She saw the version of Victor who had walked these halls with Lavinia Thorne, laughing at the simplicity of his former life. She saw the cold, hard ambition that had fueled the betrayal. But then, she saw something else. In the center of the grand hallway, on a pedestal of dark mahogany, sat her old, battered wooden soup ladle. The triplets had found it. They had cleaned it, polished the wood, and placed it there like a piece of high art. It was a bridge between her old world and this new one. Antonia touched the wood, and the vertigo passed. "We want to show you your room," Zara said, leading her up the sweeping staircase. The master suite was larger than the entire cottage Antonia had shared with her mother. The bed was a sea of Egyptian cotton and silk pillows. The windows opened onto a balcony that overlooked the entire Bay of Eldoria. From here, she could see the flickering lights of the market district, a tiny spark in the darkening twilight. "It's beautiful," Antonia said, and for the first time that day, she felt the weight of her fatigue. Not the bone-deep exhaustion of the market, but the heavy, healing tiredness of a soldier coming home from a war. But as Antonia was settling into her new life, the rest of Eldoria was in an uproar. Word of the Market Queen's ascension had reached the upper district within hours. In the exclusive clubs and high-rise offices, the name Antonia was being whispered with a mixture of awe and terror. The ZLK syndicate wasn't just a new player. They were a wrecking ball, and the fact that they were led by 3 former street kids who owed everything to a Buka cook was the scandal of the century. And then there was Victor. Victor Langston was sitting in his study in a smaller, much more modest house on the other side of the cliff. The years had not been kind to him. After the merger with the Thorn Empire had soured and Lavinia had divorced him, taking 2/3 of the assets and half his dignity, Victor had struggled to maintain his footing. He was still wealthy by Harbor's Edge standards, but in the world of the elite, he was a fading shadow. He was staring at the evening paper. The front page featured a grainy photo of the 3 Royces in the market and a headline that read, #The Return of the Storm Birds. Street Heir's Gift Estate to Market Madam. Victor's hand shook, slopping his expensive brandy onto the mahogany desk. He recognized the name Antonia, of course. He'd spent 15 years trying to bury it, trying to convince himself that she was a necessary sacrifice on his altar of progress. He'd assumed she had died of the fever or faded into the gray anonymity of the poor. But to see her now, to see her standing between 3 titans of industry, looking radiant and strong, it was a blow to his ego that hurt more than any financial loss. "She's in my house," he whispered to the empty room. "She's in the Thorn estate." He felt a sudden, desperate urge to see her. Not out of love, Victor wasn't capable of that kind of depth, but out of a need to reclaim some piece of his narrative. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that his betrayal had been business. He wanted to see if the girl who used to dance on the sand was still there, or if she had become as hard as the marble he now lived in. Back at the mansion, the first night was anything but quiet. The triplets didn't want a catered meal. They didn't want the French chefs they'd hired to serve them a 5-course dinner. Instead, they did something that made the household staff gasp in horror. They went to the kitchen. The kitchen of the Langston Thorn estate was a cavernous space of stainless steel and industrial stoves. It was designed for a staff of 20. But that night, it belonged to 4 people. Antonia, wearing a new silk robe but with her sleeves rolled up, stood at the center island. She had sent Kai out to the local night market to get real ingredients: fresh ginger, Scotch bonnets, dried crayfish, and palm oil. "You're going to cook?" Zara asked, leaning against a marble counter. "Auntie, you have a staff now. You could have anything in the world." "I have everything in the world," Antonia said, her eyes bright with a familiar fire. "And what I have is the need to feed my children. You think a French chef knows how to make the stew that kept you alive? You think they know the secret of the ginger lily?" For the next 2 hours, the mansion was filled with a scent it had never known. The sharp, spicy, soul-warming aroma of Hope's hearth. They ate on the floor of the grand dining room, sitting on the thick Persian rugs because the 30-foot mahogany table felt too formal, too much like a barrier. They laughed until they cried. They told the stories of the lost years in detail. Kai told her about the diamond mines in the north, how they'd been taken by an uncle who saw them as nothing more than labor, how he'd protected the girls, working double shifts in the dark, damp earth so they could stay in the camp school. Zara told her about the woman who had discovered her sketches, a French trader who saw the genius in the way a 10-year-old drew the patterns of the market. How she'd been whisked away to an apprenticeship in Paris, writing letters to Kai and Lena every single day until they could be reunited. Lena told her about the buildings she'd designed in her head while she was scrubbing floors in the uncle's house. Buildings that had no walls, only light and air, modeled after Antonia's open-air cart. "We never forgot the taste of your rice," Kai said, his voice thick with emotion. "In the darkest moments, when the cold was biting and we didn't know if we'd see the sun, we'd talk about the kind madam. You weren't just a person to us, Auntie. You were proof that the world wasn't entirely made of stone." Antonia listened, her heart breaking and mending 1,000 times over. She realized then that her resilience hadn't just saved her own life. It had provided the blueprint for theirs. By rising from her bed of fever, she had given them the permission to rise from their own circumstances. "I have a confession," Antonia said, looking at the three of them. "All those years I thought I was the one doing the saving. I thought I was the strong one. But sitting here now, I realized that you three were the ones holding me up. Every bowl I filled for you was a way of filling the hole Victor left in me. You didn't just give me a family. You gave me back my soul." The night grew long. Outside, the ocean whispered to the shore, the same secrets it had been telling since Antonia was a girl. But inside the mansion of ghosts, a new story was being written. The next morning, the first visitor arrived. It wasn't the mayor or the head of the bank. It was a man in a rumpled suit, looking older than his years, standing at the gates with a bouquet of wilting lilies. Victor Langston had come to call. The security guard at the gate spoke into the intercom. "Madam Antonia, there is a Mr. Victor Langston here to see you. He says he's an old friend." Antonia was in the garden, showing Lena where she wanted to plant the rosemary and the ginger lily. She froze. The name hit her like a cold draft, but it didn't have the power it once did. It didn't make her heart race with fear or ache with longing. It just sounded small. Kai, who was nearby, stood up, his face darkening into a mask of pure, lethal protective rage. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll have him removed from the property." Antonia reached out and touched Kai's arm. "No, Kai, let him in. Auntie, after what he did, I became the woman who could raise you," Antonia said, her voice steady and calm. "He is a part of my story, but he is no longer the author. Let him come to the garden. I want him to see the herbs." My friend, you can only imagine the look on Victor's face as he walked through those gardens. Gardens he once thought were too low for his ambitions, to find the woman he'd left for dead. But that meeting, that's the final seasoning on this dish. If you've been following along, you know that the happily ever after isn't about the money or the mansion. It's about the moment the person who tried to break you realizes they only succeeded in making you unbreakable. Let's head back to that garden on the North Cliff, where the scent of rosemary is about to meet the stench of regret. Victor Langston walked through the white quartz paths of the estate with the gait of a man who was trespassing in his own memories. He clutched the wilting lilies like a shield, his eyes darting from the marble statues to the lush, vibrant herb garden that now dominated the West Wing. He looked old, not the dignified old of Antonia, but the frayed, hollow old of a man who had spent his life chasing shadows and finally caught them. When he saw Antonia, he stopped. She was standing by a patch of ginger lily, her back to him. She wasn't wearing silks or jewels. She was wearing a simple, high-quality linen dress the color of the earth, her silver braids caught in a practical knot. "Antonia," he called out. His voice, once a smooth baritone that could charm the birds from the trees, was now thin and reedy. Antonia turned slowly. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She looked at him with a calm, analytical gaze, the way one might look at a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room. "Victor," she said. The name held no weight, no anger, no longing, just a statement of fact. Victor stepped forward, trying to summon the old charm. He gestured vaguely at the mansion. It's a magnificent place. I always told you I'd put you in a palace like this. I suppose I was just a bit late in delivering." Antonia let out a soft, melodic laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a laugh of genuine amusement. "You didn't deliver this, Victor. My children did. The ones you would have left in the mud while you were busy buying Lavinia's favor." Victor's face clouded with a momentary flash of the old arrogance. "I did what I had to do for my business, Antonia. You were sick. The world was moving fast. I thought you'd be better off with your mother's herbs than in the cutthroat world of the upper district." "You thought I was dead weight," Antonia said, her voice like a cool breeze. "And you were right. I was weight, but I wasn't dead. I was the anchor you decided to cut loose so you could sail faster. But the thing about anchors, Victor, is that they belong to the depths. And the depths are where the real treasures are hidden." At that moment, Kai, Zara, and Lena stepped out from the shadows of the veranda. They didn't say a word. They didn't have to. They stood behind Antonia like a wall of living granite. Kai, with his scarred cheek and his powerful frame. Zara, with her razor-sharp elegance. And Lena, with her quiet, watchful intelligence. Victor looked at them, and for the first time he truly saw the scale of his failure. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the chance to be part of a legacy that would outlive the city itself. I came to apologize," Victor stammered, the lilies trembling in his hand. "I heard about the foundation. I thought I could offer my services. The Langston Thorne shipping lines still have some influence." Kai stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The Langston Thorne shipping line is currently being audited by the ZLK Syndicate for labor violations in the northern ports, Mr. Langston. Your influence is a currency that has no value here." Antonia raised a hand, and Kai stepped back instantly. She looked at Victor, and for a second, a flicker of the girl from Harbor's Edge appeared in her eyes, the girl who believed in the rhythm of the city. "Victor," she said softly, "I forgave you a long time ago, not because you deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry your ghost in my kitchen. You were the storm that broke my house, but the storm is also what brought the rain. Look at them." She gestured to the triplets. "Without your betrayal, I would never have found them. I would have lived a small, comfortable life, and they would have died in the street. You are the villain of my story, but you were also the catalyst for my greatest victory." She stepped toward him and took the wilting lilies from his hand. She didn't throw them away. She walked to a stone bench and set them down. "You can go now, Victor," she said. "The gate is open. It's the only thing in this house that belongs to the world you built. My world is inside." Victor Langston turned and walked away. He didn't look back. As he passed through the silver gates, he looked like a man disappearing into a fog. He was no longer a titan. He was just a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a table that was now empty. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Antonia's life. The transition from the market to the mansion was handled with her trademark efficiency. She didn't turn the estate into a fortress of wealth. She turned it into a hub of hope. The Hope's Hearth Foundation was officially launched with a gala that the city would talk about for decades. But it wasn't a gala for the elite. Antonia insisted that the guests of honor be the market vendors, the fishermen, and the invisibles of Eldoria. I want you to picture that night. The grand ballroom of the Thorne estate, with its crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains, was filled with the smell of jollof rice and grilled suya. Men with calloused hands danced on the Persian rugs. Market women in their best brightly colored wraps sat on the silk sofas, laughing and sharing stories. At the center of it all was the Antonia Culinary Institute. The plans were unveiled that night, a state-of-the-art facility built on the site of the old warehouse where the triplets had been taken. It would provide free training for any child of the streets who wanted to learn the art of the hearth. "We aren't just teaching them to cook," Antonia told the crowd, standing at the podium with Kai and the girls at her side. "We are teaching them that their hands have power, that the flavors of our ancestors are a language that can cross any ocean. We are teaching them that no one, no matter how small, no matter how hungry, is ever discarded by the universe. The years that followed were a golden afternoon that seemed to never end. Antonia lived to see the first class of the institute graduate. She watched little Gilo, the boy she'd fed in the market, become the head chef of a grand hotel in the city center. She saw the market district transform into a place of dignity and beauty, where no child ever had to huddle under a leaking awning for warmth. She became a grandmother, not by blood, but by a love that was thicker than any tea. Zara married a man who built schools. Lena designed the city's first public library, and Kai became the protector of Eldoria's soul, ensuring that the wealth of the syndicate was always used to lift the floor, not just raise the ceiling. On her 80th birthday, Antonia sat on the balcony of the North Cliff mansion. The sun was dipping low into the bay, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, the same colors she'd seen as a girl in Harbor's Edge. She looked at her hands. They were gnarled and spotted with age, the map of 1,000 meals and 1,000,000 heartbeats. She looked at the 3 chairs beside her, where Kai, Zara, and Lena sat, their own hair starting to show streaks of silver. "Are you happy, Mama?" Lena asked, leaning her head on Antonia's shoulder. Antonia looked out at the city of Eldoria. She saw the lights of the market district twinkling like a fallen galaxy. She saw the silhouettes of the ships in the harbor, carrying the spices and silks of the world. She felt the warmth of the 3 souls she had raised from the dust. "I am more than happy, my child," Antonia whispered. "I am fulfilled. I have loved the right way with my whole soul, no holding back. And the world loved me back." She closed her eyes, the sound of the ocean whispering a final thank you to the shore. And that, my friend, is the story of Madame Antonia. It's a story that reminds us that betrayal is just a detour, not a dead end. It's proof that the smallest act of compassion, a bowl of soup, a kind word, a steady hand, can ripple outward until it changes the world. I'm sitting here now, looking at the bottom of my coffee cup, feeling that same warmth I hope you're feeling. Thank you for staying with me through the hurt and the healing. It's been a privilege to share this fire with you. If Antonia's journey touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength or gave you hope for a tomorrow you can't quite see yet, do me a favor. Don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below. I want to know where you're listening from and what part of this tale hit home for you. Share this with someone who's currently in their storm and needs to know that the Rolls-Royces are on their way. Until we meet again for the next story, remember what Antonia taught us. Keep your heart warm, keep your heart open, and always, always love correctly. This is your storyteller friend, signing off. Take care of yourself out there. See you in the comments.